Welcome to the latest episode. The idea of this is that we're shining a light on people who are doing work, like practical work, that shapes the culture or people experience of a company. And in this series, we have short snippets, like 5 minutes from each person, where we'll get a taste and an insight into the work they're doing. And if you find any of it particularly interesting, then you can connect with them on LinkedIn afterwards. Okay, so we'll start with introductions. Over to Sarah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Hood. I'm the head of engagement for Bupa. You might know our name. We're an international healthcare company, and we're best known for health insurance and healthcare provision, so hospitals, clinics, and residential aged care.
Hi, my name's Dani. I'm People Change Manager for the South Yorkshire Combined Authority. So recently moved into local authority and managing all the change, engagement and cultural pieces kind of within that organisation at the moment.
Hey everyone, my name's Ginni. I've worked in people and culture for well over 10 years now, working mostly with startups and scale-ups in the tech space. At the time of recording this podcast, I am very nearly at the 1 year mark since I left a VP of People role. I left that role upon what I would call the potent realization that I was working in spite of rather than in alignment with the sort of business leadership, and having entirely burnt myself out trying to make a not people-centric business feel like one, I told myself never again. And so I launched my own consultancy. We're called CultureClimate. The reason that's our name is because we do two things. We shape scalable, sustainable workplace culture, acting as fractional chief people officers. And we also partner with brands to create really bold thought leadership on the current HR climate.
All right. Well, hey, I'm Jeet, co-founder of Kinfolk. Thanks for having me here. Previously, I've led product at work tech companies like Beamery and Hubble. I'm a big fan of hybrid and distributed work, but what we've seen and experienced actually is that it's made it even harder for people teams to create amazing employee journeys. Despite having the HRIS, ATS, LMS, you name all the acronyms, particularly at key moments like onboarding, parental leave and sick leave and exits. And teams are still using a patchwork of tools. It's actually got more complex. So that's really why we're building Kinfolk as a mission control for managing the hybrid employee experience. So you can basically plug in your people tech stack and create interactive playbooks that then bring together the comms, the content and connections needed to guide everyone through those key moments. Glad to be on.
Okay, so 5 minutes. I'm a talker, so this is going to be fun. So the focus of my day-to-day role at Bupa is predominantly employee listening and employee engagement, but every now and then I get to work on really cool culture-related projects, and what I'd like to talk about today is our values. So we refreshed our company values for Bupa a couple of years ago. So cast your mind back to 2021, which was obviously still a ridiculously hard year. It was a really hard year for our frontline health and care workers at Bupa specifically. But it was also strangely an exciting time for Bupa because we appointed a new CEO at the end of 2020 who came in and refreshed our purpose, our ambition, and our strategy. And we used the elephant as a metaphor for our refreshed strategy. Why on earth an elephant? Well, our CEO likened Bupa to an elephant, strong, stable, kind of well-known large animal, but really he said that we were like a lying down, sleeping elephant. We really needed to get up, get moving, get running. Elephants can run at tremendous speeds, and that the environment that the elephant was in was becoming more challenging. So all this means, I could talk for hours about the elephant metaphor, but all this means is that a huge heightened sense of ambition and a bright future for Bupa. But it led to the natural question of, with a refreshed purpose, ambition, strategy, what about the values? So we got our 60 most senior leaders at Bupa together, and we asked them that very question. With all of this heightened ambition, is now the time to refresh our values. We gave them some guidance, which I'll mention briefly, but we essentially split them into small teams to go away for a very short period of time, and then come back and share what they felt needed to be done around their values. The guidance that we gave them, again, I won't go into too much detail, but things like, we gave a bit of knowledge sharing about what values are. are, that you can have a nice blend of them. You can have core values and aspirational values, but to choose wisely, because they need to be seen to be believed. So those small groups went away and came back, were unanimous, firstly, that Bupa did need to refresh its values. It had 7 previously, and the joke on the street was that was too many to remember. And then there were themes that came through, but I'll jump straight to what our new values actually are, which will help you understand the themes. So the first one is brave. And the reason, it's probably obvious from what I've just told you about the strategy, that's our call to action, kind of our aspirational value. That's what we need to become at Bupa from a values and behaviours and culture perspective to achieve our ambition. So, and it's always the first whenever we talk about our values, because that really is the call to action for our people here. The second one is caring. That's very much our DNA. That's where we were born, and that's kind of, we're very proud that's kind of the essential part of Bupa, but we don't want to become complacent. It could be seen as our competitive advantage, so really important that it's in there for us. And then finally, responsible, which is, I suppose, it just kind of does what it says on the tin. Very, very important. What did we do next? So we got these 3 new values. The senior leaders were very happy with what they'd, took quite a lot of time wordsmithing, etc., but really happy with where we'd got to. The first thing that we did was that we didn't wait. We didn't pause and hold it as a secret. We gave license to those leaders straight away the moment that those values were agreed to go and start talking to their people about it. And I'll come back to why that was important shortly. We then obviously followed that up with a really important launch and communication work, all of the kind of, I suppose, the updating and refreshing, that's the easy bit, but just kind of making sure that the awareness was out there. Then it got to the really tricky bit. So then, you need to think about the how do you actually embed these values into the culture? And so, again, I could talk for hours about all of the various things that we've done, but I'll talk maybe just briefly about 4 pivotal things that I think have been important for us in the journey. First of all, simplicity. So to go from 7 to 3, and 3, what we feel is like 3 simple, easy to understand words. There's no kind of, hopefully it doesn't feel corporate mumbo jumbo, just nice, good human words that we use in our lives day to day. Simplicity, really, really important. Secondly, role modelling. So I think because we kind of took that approach of our senior leaders developing them, actually the role modelling was almost done for us, in that they lived and owned and were very authentic with the values from that very first day. And actually I would challenge anyone to go onto LinkedIn and just type in search for posts on Bupa and any of those values that I've just mentioned, and you will find reams of posts. And that was not architected, it's not planned, it's not managed. That's come from our leaders. So we're really proud of that. But again, it's just demonstrating that the role modelling is happening. It's worth mentioning behaviours and kind of performance, and how we help our people kind of really understand how these values translate and into how people show up every day. Tricky stuff. We've done quite a bit of work in describing the behaviours, describing the shadow behaviours for certain areas. We're a large global company, so not all of our businesses needed that depth. And obviously with performance management, we're really strong in the guidance that we give to our leaders around performance should be evaluated in just as much the how as the what. So I think there's still more to do. Performance management's one of those things that I don't think anyone's fully happy with what we've got. So I still think there's probably more to do from that perspective. And then just finally on this topic, really, really important aspect of making sure that this is continuing to happen. It's a couple of years down the track now. Back to my day job of employee listening, we run twice yearly engagement surveys across Bupa that are very culturally focused, and we very often will have a very, very focused values question asking our people, are they seeing values being lived by the people of Bupa? So we can keep a really close monitor and keep a tabs on how people are seeing. And again, the progress would indicate so far, again, our overall engagement trajectory is in a really good place at the moment, and our people are very forthcoming with their feedback in terms of the volume of comments that we receive. So we trust that the feedback that we're getting through that survey is really robust, and it's, again, so far so good. But the good thing about having that ongoing monitor process is that we can kind of think about what we need to do more should we get to a point where our people feel that they're not being lived. And I will pause there.
I think one of the things I picked up on your presentation, Sarah, was around role modelling. So in terms of, apart from obviously briefing your stakeholders at the beginning in terms of like how they could approach that task, what do you think were the most important steps in terms of getting them to kind of walk the walk, as it were, and get them to kind of live the values and set that example for kind of the wider teams?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Again, I don't feel like there was much like architecting or planning or managing it of that from our perspective. So I suppose in some aspects, I could say we got lucky. But from what we observed in this leadership team, I would say our new CEO, you could just tell from the energy that he injected into Bupa at that time. And he's a very passionate, charismatic individual, and he was very, very involved in the wordsmithing. So he really wanted to get the values just perfect for him, I think, because, very strong believer that, if it's very much owned and created almost from the top. It's one of those instances, actually, because the role modeling is so important, that actually it's one of those instances that it certainly feels like him being so engaged in this really helped kind of just set the tone of that role modeling, because it was probably quite a pressured time for our leaders, all of this newness. Everyone in some respects wanted to really demonstrate that they were on board. So it's probably a culmination of all of those aspects. But yeah, I would definitely say we didn't, I don't think we sort of managed it or architected it in any way from our side of things in the HR function.
I did say this is going to be a fast-paced show. So thank you so much, Sarah. Danny?
I think kind of from my perspective, because I've just moved roles, I'm kind of looking at this from a more holistic perspective around communication and engagement of teams and how that fits into an HR and cultural perspective. So my background has predominantly been in creative organisations, so kind of whether that's startup or marketing communications. And now I'm finding myself in a completely different role, working within local authority and assisting them with a whole people change transformation program. And one of the things that I've kind of reached a conclusion on during this time is actually people problems and people issues tend to be the same across lots of different organisations, regardless of where you're working or what you're doing. And some of the learnings that I think I've taken from previous roles and applied it into kind of this one really comes down for me to the 3 C's. So communication, clarity, and consistency. And not only is that in terms of kind of the actions and behaviours that managers should be portraying, kind of to the role modelling that Sarah was talking about before, but also around how by leading by that role modelling example, you can drive the behaviours that you want to see within your people organisations as well. And I'm from a kind of background in the sense of I always struggle with the HR versus creativity piece. I'm married to a musician, so part of me really wants to be really creative and kind of think outside the box at all times. But one of the things that I've found kind of really important over in terms of realising is that working within a people, culture, HR space, actually we've got the kind of a really important job of navigating through kind of the black and white stuff that you would find within like legislation and statute and or policies, procedures, contracts and all of that, but humanising it and interpreting it in a way that makes sense for your people within the organisation that you're working on. And going back to the 3 C's, working with those managers to kind of communicate what those are, but in a way that's actually meaningful to the teams that you work in and the organisation that you find yourselves in, lends itself to clarity. And that clarity helps to drive kind of the behaviours that you're looking for. And through clarity, there's increased well-being and higher engagement just because individuals are more likely to know, sorry about the pings by the way, are more likely to know what's expected of them and how they're kind of meant to portray their roles and kind of show up at work. And then the kind of the 3rd C around consistency is that if you've got that clarity and that understanding around around those expectations and what's required from you at work, then actually the consistency and being able to bring that to the table will then in itself lead to higher performing cultures, managers that are able to kind of more closely manage their teams on a day-to-day basis, all of that therefore kind of leading to higher engagement scores, higher productivity further down the line as well. So I think the conclusion that I've reached in terms of managing change within a local authority based on kind of the private sector experience that I've gained is more along the lines of actually get the basics and get the foundations really, really right, because as soon as you start gaining trust from wider stakeholders and management from that perspective, that trust trickles down to kind of those team members. And then as soon as you start fostering that trust within those team members, you will start seeing kind of the benefits that every single people person is looking for, and that's probably when you can start thinking a little bit more outside the box and like moving the needle to kind of the the transformation programs, the award winnings, the kind of all the cool stuff that as people we really want to be well known for as well.
So I love this notion of trust trickling down. And I also really like what you said around your 3 C's and the sort of communication gap and what happens in those gaps. So, our brains are wired to fill gaps with uncertainty. I've known lots of businesses that think no news is good news. And I'm like, that's not how human beings work. If you don't fill that gap, they are going to assume something in that gap, and it's completely inappropriate to think that they would just assume something positive. That can sometimes run against the notion of consistency, though, because I know people that are like, you can never communicate too much. How did you get that balance right between constant communication and consistent messaging?
So I think the balance from that, step back. From a leadership perspective, I think leaders are within their roles have to balance the message that they want to get out to the teams, but also in terms of how to deliver that messaging as well. So in terms of addressing the balance between the communication and the consistency, it will be different depending on the organisation that you step in and the leadership teams that you're working with, because naturally there might be some organisations that are more used to that constant communication, and therefore the teams have become used to that as well. And actually, to your point around, filling in the gaps with uncertainty, it boils down to the neuroscience of it all. So the more that you're filling in these gaps with kind of expected actions and behaviours, then the more the teams will be able to fill in those uncertainties with experiences that they've been part of or have been privy to before. So I think kind of the general notion for me is starting small from the very beginning, and then over time these change programs and transformation programs will kind of develop into their own culture in a way, and change will just become a way that a company or an organisation does stuff, and they will be able to kind of find their own way in being able to do that. So I don't know, that's a really long-winded way of saying there's no one size fits all, and actually the level of communication and what you share will depend on what you know of your business and your teams at that time, so that you balance the message with what you want them to take on board as well.
You did great, Danny. Ginny, over to you.
In preparing for this podcast and thinking about the initiatives that I could discuss, I actually decided not to talk directly about delivering for the wider org, but more specifically for my people function. So I guess as part of my own journey over the last sort of year, it's involved lots of reflection, and I also made a decision to just sort of say yes to introductions, and you talk to someone, it introduces you to somebody, and it's been amazing. I've re-engaged with lots of people in my network, I've met lots of new people, and it feels like it's safe to say, albeit that anecdotally, but that from the community that I am a part of, there's lots of people, professionals, still experiencing, broadly speaking, under-resourced teams. And if you've got an under-resourced team and you're sort of operating against a culture where businesses, particularly in the space I operate, which is tech, early stage companies, lots of very difficult decisions have been made recently, lots of culture and sort of people debt has been accrued within these organizations. And when you have a small people team that is in a very pressured environment, it can be really hard to retain those good people, right? So I wanted to talk about sort of investing in people careers. And I actually this morning got some feedback from a couple of the people that I used to manage, and there was agreement wholeheartedly that this was a positive initiative, actually not just for them, but for the wider org in terms of the sort of, I guess, ripple effects and snowball that came from it. So I am obsessed with internal communication. I'm actually side hustling on a little internal comms tech product idea. I'm speaking to a lot of people who have got vested interest in internal communication. And the smaller the org, generally, the more likely it is for that to strategically not really sit anywhere or have any particular ownership. It's that we all internally communicate, but from a comm strategy perspective, it doesn't necessarily have a home. I've tried to tackle that in my own roles, almost sort of chief of staffing, I guess, a little bit with leaders and thinking about, okay, what is going into our all hands? What are our narratives? What are the sort of storytelling arcs that we want to be delivering? Why? How do we make access to important information fair across a distributed international team? How do we maintain our knowledge bases? All of that sort of stuff. So I built a comms calendar that my team were responsible for maintaining and contributing to and delivering. We worked very hard on our sort of, I guess, marketing mindsets as people professionals. As part of this, I really wanted to make sure that my team felt confident as that sort of, I guess, centralized figurehead for the business, the company. So I arranged for some facilitation training for my team from someone. Her name is Ali. She's an incredible person. She's probably in a few people's shared networks here. I can see some smiles on the call. She delivered, as she obviously would, an incredible job. And the team have absolutely, they say, continued to use everything they learned sort of day in, day out. So that was really about enabling them to sort of launch themselves into the amount of training they were delivering. So things like my talent acquisition manager was delivering, sort of fair hiring training and how to interview effectively, but also just the amount of sort of daily expectation management they were doing. So whether that is sort of triaging inbound requests from across the business, doing stay interviews, we did month one check-ins with new joiners, like in so many ways, I think it was one of the best things that we did. So yes, I wanted to bring it to this forum. So yes, less about necessarily a sort of bottom up, holistic sort of initiative, but something that I think is really important. And I think a lot of people, teams at the moment, would really benefit from.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I too am very passionate about actually the career development of HR professionals, because I do think maybe if you were to look at functionally around the world, different professions, I wonder if HR index is the lowest in terms of thinking about our own career development, because we're kind of by nature serving businesses. Well, maybe historically, I think we're becoming a bit more strategic now. But how did you choose facilitation? I suppose I think you maybe alluded to it a little bit in terms of the challenges that your team was against. But of all the things that you could have kind of bolstered your team with through that development, why did you pick facilitation specifically?
I think it is basically how you sort of set that question up. There's two sides of it. And one side is very much this, there's no HR for HR thing. So there is a certain amount of, look, these are stressful jobs. There is always too much to be done, then there is time in the day to do it. And as part of the myriad sort of skill sets that those individuals needed to have to deliver effectively in their roles, they also needed to be able to look after themselves, right, and take care of their own well-being. And obviously I was invested in their well-being. So I think part of it is like almost a muscle that you could then, once you've had some initial training, And this training was very practical. It's not a lecture-based thing. It's very much sort of practice and leaning into it and building that confidence then meant in those moments, where there is a unique sort of people stress, I think, of that overwhelm starting to build, and then you have that one more difficult conversation to have, or that one more complaint that's coming at you, and it would be so easy to just snap. I think it's a piece of training that they could then go back to in those moments and go, okay, right, if you are a facilitator, how do you handle this? And I need to put my facilitator hat back on, which then feeds into the second part with it. It's that I think it is very applicable. I think the skills are so transferable that you build by building that confidence, that I could see by one piece of sort of learning and development that would therefore be highly engaging because it had a high level of transfer to their roles. We could really upskill quite tangibly across sort of the whole people experience in every part of the employee life cycle that they were serving, as it were, hopefully enabling. So yeah.
It's really amazing to see that you've created something that people come back to. Typically what we tend to hear is that, we've done this training, we've ticked it off, and that's kind of it. What did you do differently, or what would you recommend doing for other trainers out there to create something that people do want to come back to and they can easily reflect on it and use practical tips from it?
I mean, I have it drilled into me from actually a university professor when I was doing my master's, who was had a real bee in his bonnet about L&D budgets. There's often money assigned, it doesn't get used. And if it does get used, it's because if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. So people go, okay, well, I'll tick boxes, I'll do a load of courses. And I think it's the wrong starting place. So for me, it's always been, how transferable back to the business is this? How much is this going to, on a daily basis, be something that you think about and draw upon? I've got some... Not like me, I have some bold opinions about the CIPD, for example. And I think of all of the things that I learnt on my CIPD, very little of it shows up actually in daily life. And that's a really big, expensive, hefty course. So yeah, it's exactly as you say, just think starting with actually what's coming up every day that's causing me the most dissonance or is holding me back from achieving the pace I need or the quality that I need. And then let's find something that solves that need as a different sort of mindset to start with budget, look at course, go from there sort of thing.
Ginni, thank you. Brilliant. Jeet, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. So I wanted to talk about the topic of new hire onboarding because that's one of the key areas that we focus on. And of course, it has an outsized impact on performance and retention. And we've been speaking regularly with people leaders in order to build up Kinfolk. And I think we did 150 initial discovery calls. So wanted to surface what's working in those companies and also what's not working. And what we found is that most companies are actually still struggle to do it really, really well. And it can cost up to twice the new hire salary, right? And I saw a Bamboo study recently where they were saying that 1 in 4 people admitted to crying in their first week. And that's only the people who've admitted to crying, let alone the other people who have not come forward. And we get something like 44 days to influence long-term retention from when they start. So it's really important. But what most people mean when they talk about onboarding is we'll do setup and orientation and some pre-boarding. But if you ask employees, yes, they want to start really quickly and ramp up, but to get fully confident and productive, it's 3 to 6 months. So that gap isn't really filled at the moment, it seems like, in most organizations. Typically in smaller organizations, you've got folks using Notion documents with a checklist, and they might say, hey, please read these docs. Here's some few messages to get you going. Please meet these people. We'll do a survey and we'll run tasks from an HRIS. But some of the issues that we found is that actually that doesn't give visibility into, have they read the information, have they understood it, are they putting it to use? Are managers and buddies as equally enabled as the person going through the process? Because that's important. How do you catch early if someone's stuck rather than waiting for that survey that comes too late? Are they ramping up at the right speed? And also something that's very important to us is it fair and consistent across the board? The reason I asked that manager dependency question is because it can depend a lot on how mature the manager is and how the team is. So how do we kind of account for those things? So there's kind of 3 areas that I wanted to dig into to add a few more C's to Danny's C's. There are a few more C's of the 6 C's of onboarding, and then also walk through some of the stages of onboarding and how those C's fit into that. And then there's 3 tips that kind of stood out from those 150 conversations that, if time, we can kind of go into as well. So diving straight into the C's. The first one is obviously, I think, compliance, and that's all around paperwork, references, right to work, making sure they've got 2-factor authentication, all those kind of things. And as I go through these C's, all the companies that are doing this really well really do thoughtfully cover all these 6 C's. So the first one's compliance, next one's clarification, and that's really around expectation setting. So role clarity, how their role links to the wider business objectives, how they can grow in their career, which is also really important from day one. We don't necessarily have to wait until probation. How clear are the policies? How clear are in terms of how their salary will grow? The third C is culture. So that's everything to do with values and behaviors, and also coming back to the policies, because a lot of the times our policies is actually quite a clear reflection of our culture. Then, of course, connection. That's the 4th C. So that's in 2 buckets, really. You got the professional connection and the personal connection. So that's not just with the manager and buddy, but also making sure that they're actually enabled to have time and carve it out to form those relationships, particularly with leaders and peers across teams. And if you've got resource groups and you've got access to mentors, it's those kind of cross-team connections that really matter. And then the other one's confidence. So do they feel they're ramping up? Right? Often we forget to ask the person themselves if they've got what they need in order to progress quickly, and we look for other signals from their work and their manager and their buddy. And related to that is the final C, the check back. So do we have feedback loops beyond the first weeks to make sure that it's they're actually ramping up quickly? So like when we look at the process, let's say if you got from hiring all the way up, we can actually start to showcase our culture with a talent hub. And there's a bunch of companies that's doing that really, really well, with readmes to be able to self-select people out, with interview tips and sharing their communities. So that's your culture, clarification, and maybe some connection. Then these companies are looking at pre-boarding really intentionally. So that's a really good time to get all the compliance done, like asking people what they've got also between jobs and what their comm style is. So while you're getting that compliance stuff done, you can also then tailor the communication that goes to these folks as well during that time, because not everyone will want to necessarily engage in the same way. So really tailoring it to them will be helpful. Then, of course, the onboarding period, which everyone's familiar with, that's all about clarification, connection, and culture as well, having those meetings and making sure that there's also something that uniquely reflects people's culture. I had a conversation where someone said that they actually asked people, this is pre-pandemic, to build a chair in the office that they would sit on, and they got other people to help, and that really reflected their values. So, like, what's our example of what that means to build a chair and reflect that culture, right? Then comes the ramp-up phase, so having templated, measurable 30, 60, 90-day plans, which then creates that transparency as well of like, are we actually promoting fairly? Are we actually hiring fairly? Is the probation period fair as well? And then post-probation, you've got the checkbacks, so still making sure it's high touch. There's nothing to say that the 90-day plans have to necessarily stop there. Some folks even continue beyond that as well. And the last 3 tips that really stood out beyond that process is that people learn differently and connect differently. So yes, we do need that consistency, but we need different modes of content and connection. And a big difference that we found when we spoke to new hires, that they said, oh, my onboarding was great because they asked me what I wanted. And that simple question really flipped it for them. So that's the first tip that I kind of took away. The second one is that I read people forget like 90% of the new information that they read within a week. So then you get like just-in-time learning rather than saying, hey, read a bunch of stuff and then hope you remember it. And the third really important thing that I took away from these conversations is that we have to enable the enablers, like the managers, the buddies, the teammates. This is not just a people team thing, and it shouldn't be. In fact, if anything, it involves managers, buddies, and teammates even more than the people team as people ramp up, right? So how do we equip them? How do we train them? How do we help them with the questions, tips, and guidance in the moment so that they can be better at their job? So, it's a quick whirlwind of onboarding, but that's the stuff that we've picked up from conversations.
I've got maybe just some reflections. That was really rich. Thank you. I just took a lot from that. It was just more of a reflection maybe, but maybe interested in your thoughts, because I was reflecting as you were talking about from an individual's perspective. I wonder if maybe there's merit in having that really transparent conversation with people around the whole it's okay not to be okay in that first period of a new job. It's like any change that we go through in our life. I sometimes wonder if we are, a lot of us are very natural perfectionists, and it may be, maybe we can overdo things on onboarding because we're trying to get to this perfect state, whereas actually it's just a natural thing to feel very uncomfortable, because you're in a new environment with new relationships, you're building trust, all these things that kind of, need to be in place for you to feel comfortable in a job. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that. It struck me as you were talking that I wonder if that would also help talking to people about that when they started new roles.
Absolutely, right. And being upfront about that, and then also figuring out how do we create that space to have that conversation as well. Some people, if they're not necessarily extroverts, they may not be as willing to speak up. So are there formats and forums? And they may not also be willing to speak up with their managers, which is why the other connections really, really matter. And giving people that sense of security and trust to say, hey, we're not expecting you to necessarily deliver straight away. Like the way that the 30, 60, 90-day plans that I'm seeing people are structuring it is initially the first 30 days is just about learning. We're not expecting anything in terms of delivery. The next 30 days is all about contributing. And then only in the final 30 days is about ownership and delivery, right? So that way it sets those clear expectations that it's okay to experiment. Everyone is going through this process, and you're going to be uncertain even after the first 90 days. But as long as we find that communication style up front, we can then allow that space to let them speak up.
I was doing a little tally chart of how many times you said the phrase ramping up, because I find it really interesting. Like whenever I've worked with very commercial teams, and certainly sales teams, right? Because if you have a revenue target, generally that initial phase of joining a job, you are literally ramping up towards that. And so it's sort of baked in, whereas other departments seem to need a little bit more coaching. And 100%, I think the vast majority, if not all of the touch points of a person's onboarding period needs to be delivered non-centrally, right? So there needs to be an element of compliance, like you say, get that out the way, but then it becomes how are you going to be optimized for the immediate environment you're in, the people that you need to collaborate with, the sort of teams and the department's goals that you're delivering against. And one of the things that I'm quite passionate about is actually removing the word probation, because I hate it. I think it's awful. Like it's akin to obviously sort of legal speak. It doesn't imply trust. These are grown-ups. There aren't probation officers walking around. You might have a buddy, but you probably don't have a probation officer. And your sort of thoughts on how we could potentially get more teams to be thinking about this ramping up mindset and thinking more about probation as onboarding, right? So it's less of a test and it's much more about enabling than testing. So yeah.
I love that. Yeah. Similar feelings with probation as well. Particularly, I think US companies I'm hearing are doing this really well, but they almost see it as like a two-way street, right? So it's not just we are deciding as a company whether you will pass the test or not. It is equally as relevant for the new hire who's come and spent the first 90 days. And as we were saying earlier on, it's actually the first 44 days. In fact, the company's more at risk than the new hire because it costs the company more than it does the new hire to go and find a new job. So yeah, the idea of probation as this like formalized check-in and go, no-go is a very strange thing. And being more cognizant of the fact that it does take more than those 3 months to be able to ramp up. Now, I appreciate that we do need some kind of a go, no-go to say like, okay, well, is this person actually ramping up in the right way? Is this person feeling like they're embedded in the right way? Are they working in the team as the team expect? And are they delivering on the goals, right? Which is where the 30, 60, 90-day plan comes in. And then how do we then extend that 30, 60, 90-day plan, which is then linked to the business outcomes to see if they are delivering on the goals that we have set out for them. And if they're not, then there are several ways to solve for that later on. But yeah, I agree that the word probation is not helpful for either party. And then also the idea of ramping up, I think the quicker we link it to the business goals and how they're hitting those outcomes, the better it will be.
Thank you all for being part of this episode. If people have found something particularly interesting, I'll put people's LinkedIns under the video or in the post, and then you can connect directly.